Well, thank you, Alon. Certainly, North Korea is not fun.
It's always fun.
Well, you know, there are some very strange habits, some people. And I might say, I don't think that the North Korean nuclear weapons are aimed at South Korea. They don't need it for South Korea. Seoul is very close. The United States is another matter. Now, the third speaker will be Dr. W.P.S. Sidhu, also an old friend. He is a senior fellow for foreign policy at the Brookings India Center and the Brookings Institution, and operates also in the framework of other institutes as well. And he has researched, written, and taught extensively on India's grand strategy, emerging powers, and global orders, etc., etc. The subject of his presentation will be the China-India-Pakistan triangle. Please.
Thank you. Yes, and we can just darken that. That'd be great. Well, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and really it's a pleasure and a delight to be back here at the annual conference and talk about issues that concern all of us in different ways. So it's really a delight and pleasure. So I'm very grateful, of course, to Shlomo Broom for the invitation and Emily Landhaus. Thank you for that. So I'm always inspired in any sort of setting by my dear friend Bruno Tetre. So looking and try and really improve on that. So Bruno had 5 points. I have 6. And one-upmanship. And the 6 that I want to talk about, and I had a fairly elaborate PowerPoint before I heard who the chair was going to be and how much time I had. So I think that's been jettisoned, although I'll be very happy to circulate it around. So the 6 sort of areas and points that I want to focus on, I want to begin with 3 caveats, some of which we've already heard, but I just want to elaborate on those a little bit. Very quickly talk about the historical introduction, provide a historical perspective to the region. And third, look at the post-Cold War scenario in particular, how we got there. Next, I'll talk about the specificity of the Asian challenge and how that's different from other parts of the world, particularly Southern Asia. Bruno had 3 no's, so obviously I also have to have 3 no's. But this is very much in the South Asian context and the Southern Asian context. I will then try and start wrapping up by presenting what is the present scenario, what are the challenges that exist at the moment, and then sort of end with what might be a possible way forward. So the first caveat that I'd like to point out is, and I think this has already been mentioned by other speakers as well, so I'll just be reiterating that, is really that regional nuclear deterrence dynamics are not isolated from the global dynamics. In fact, there's a very, developments in the latter arena do impact on the regional arena as well. And particularly, this is also the case in Southern Asia. Second, I would also argue, and again we've heard other speakers say this as well, regions are not isolated from each other either. There's always learning, there's cooperation, there's interaction between these regions. And this is not only the case in the nuclear arena. For example, the 1967 Six-Day War was a lesson for many other regions. And if you look at India's 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, you can see a lot of lessons learned from the 1967 war. So there's a lot of learning across regions. But the same is also true in the nuclear arena in particular. And I'll just give you 3 instances, all of which, by the way, have already been referred to. Chinese missiles in Saudi Arabia, the AQ Khan network and its, shall we say, contribution to Iran and Libya is very obvious. And as we just heard, DPRK's alleged role in Syria. So you can see that there's a lot of interaction within, between regions as well, and that's also important for us to look at. This is not to say that we shouldn't look at regions, but simply to sort of argue that it might be useful to see how regions also influence other regions. Last but not the least, I think the role of the United States in almost every other regional conflict has to be underlined. And so if I'm looking at Southern Asia, which is what I'll come to in a moment, it is not really a triangular competition. It is in fact a four-cornered competition, which includes the United States, in the following way, particularly if you look at the US-China contest. So you've got, in some ways, a US-China contest, which is a top-down contest at the global level, but then you've also got a bottom-up contest between Pakistan, China, India, and Pakistan. And all of these caveats have to be kept in mind while we're looking at nuclear deterrence. Now, before I go into more details about Southern Asia, let me share with you what my sense and concept understanding is of nuclear deterrence and strategic stability globally, and what we understand by that. And essentially, nuclear deterrence, as I understand it, is really premised on three interlocking concepts. First is the elaboration of the nuclear deterrence concept with the objective of preserving a no-nuclear war, and in fact it could be argued a no-war scenario between nuclear weapon states. Second, the management of deterrence among the major powers and their allies through a number of bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral institutions, as well as arms control, and in some cases even disarmament. So if you think about bilateral, think of the US-Soviet, US-Russian agreements. If you look at plurilateral, and as Bruno articulated, the NATO role, Warsaw Pact, and the CSCE, all of them played a role in providing a framework. And of course, finally, the multilateral. And in this case in particular, it's got to be the United Nations Security Council, where all of the nuclear weapon states also get to sit and, in some ways address their differences. But of course, we also had arms control, START, and SALT, but also disarmament, and I'm thinking particularly about the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. And finally, and this is an important component, was also the construction of the non-proliferation regime. And this was really also done to preserve the nuclear deterrence order and strategic development, strategic balance, by preventing new challenges both at the global and regional level, because really there's very little faith that strategic balance and related stability could be preserved at the nth country level, so that if there's open-ended proliferation, that you will still be able to ensure and assure deterrence in some ways. That's quite unlikely. But there were three dramatic changes in the post-Cold War arena which started to challenge this fundamental or this classic deterrence concept. First was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and its inability, if you like, to maintain that strategic stability was clearly compromised. This was, on the other hand, coupled with the inability to fundamentally transform the relationship with Russia from an adversarial to a quasi-ally position. On the other hand, the other key actor at the global level, the United States, sought absolute security instead of mutual insecurity, which in some ways was the basis of deterrence relationship as we understand it. Second, the quest for absolute security also led the United States and its allies to put greater emphasis on defense rather than deterrence. And this again sort of shifted, if you like, with the growing role of enhancement of conventional capabilities over the nuclear arsenal, it almost, which became possible towards the end of the Cold War because of technical, economic, and other reasons as well. And last but not the least was the emergence of a number of nuclear-armed and nuclear-capable states, particularly outside of the East-West context, notably in Asia, China, DPRK, India, Israel, and Pakistan, who also challenged the traditional notion of strategic balance and strategic stability in three ways. And let me come to, the Asian challenge and how Asia differs in its concept of, deterrence, nuclear deterrence, than the classic model. First of all, geopolitics in Asia in general, but Southern Asia in particular, and here I'm talking about China, India, and Pakistan, is very different. There are disputed borders and undemarcated borders, very short distances, which really blur the distinction between strategic and tactical. And these really pose a very critical challenge to the traditional notion of deterrence. Second, none of these countries have actually bought into the deterrence and strategic stability concept as it was developed in the East-West context. So, for example, if you talk in terms of doctrine, China and India talk about a no first use doctrine, which is alien, if you like, in the East-West context. Second, there's also an enhancement of weapons, both at the qualitative and the quantitative level. Third, if you look at deployment, both India and China in particular focus on a de-alerted and non-deployed posture. Again, very different from the East-West context as well. But the important part is that even though they are different from the East-West context, they did not actually provide an alternative narrative to underpin their concept of deterrence. Last but not the least is that the institutions to ensure a no war and a no nuclear war scenario has never been developed, either by the regional actors or the global powers, and remained either very non-existent or really very weak. There are some bilateral or regional norms and institutions that have been set up in the Southern Asian context, but they're really not of the level of either the OSCE or NATO or the Warsaw Pact at all. The ASEAN Regional Forum is perhaps one of the few exceptions, but it has huge limitations in this context as well. And of course, the absence of these countries, either in the United Nations Security Council or as members of the NPT or even the Nuclear Suppliers Group, means there's very little engagement with them on trying to prevent further proliferation or also enhance relations among themselves. Last but not the least is that if you look at Southern Asia, nuclear armed states have not undertaken any nuclear arms control at all. And this is particularly the case in the bilateral context. At the multilateral level, all three countries have actually carried out and are carrying out chemical weapons disarmament. But this is really happening at the global level, through a global institution, not at the bilateral or the regional level. This then brings me to the three no's that we're starting to see in Southern Asia. The first, and this is a double negative, is a no nuclear build-up policy. In fact, what you're seeing is a qualitative and quantitative enhancement in nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Now, I do want to point out that this is obviously not at the pace or level that we saw in the East-West context, but it is significant. And so, for example, just to give you one contrast, countries in Southern Asia are moving towards a nuclear triad, whereas we know European nuclear weapon states are actually moving away from a nuclear triad, or have moved away already from a nuclear triad. One explanation, of course, is that Southern Asia is moving from a lower base, but it is now building up quite rapidly. In addition, while the global trend is moving against the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, the trend in Southern Asia is actually going in the other direction. Moreover, the deployment of agile, multiple warhead, both conventional and nuclear, medium-range missiles is also blurring the distinction between conventional and nuclear deterrence. Coupled with growing cyber and anti-satellite capabilities, which again was referred to in the East-West context, the traditional concept of deterrence is unlikely to be relevant in the long run in Southern Asia. And finally, the development of and deployment of a sea-based deterrence in Southern Asia is also likely to challenge the informally held practice of a de-alerted and non-deployed nuclear arsenal, with the added complexity of delegating launch authority to the submarine commander. This has in fact led, maybe one of the reasons why the new government in India, literally fresh off the mint of the elections, has actually called to revise and update India's decade-old nuclear doctrine. And it remains to be seen how that will be done. But I also want to the second no is that there has been absolutely no arms control experience in the Southern Asian context, and there's in fact a reluctance to engage in this whole exercise. And the third no is that there's really no bilateral, regional, or global architecture to manage relations and preserve a no-nuclear war scenario between these three countries. Although India and Pakistan do have some elements of a bilateral architecture, they still really have to be fully implemented, and there's much needs to be done in that context. So let me very quickly then talk about the present scenario and what are the present challenges in this nuclear triangle. But here I would, as I mentioned, also look at the dynamics of the role of the United States in the region. First, the US-China global rivalry has actually given Beijing a cover to modernize and expand its nuclear arsenal with regional implications. And I'm talking in particular about the DF-25C, 3,500 kilometer range, multiple warhead missile, which can target US interests in the region, but more importantly, covers India. And that's going to be a very significant sort of element there as well. Second, nuclear and conventional asymmetry are blurring the nuclear and conventional sort of scenario between India and Pakistan and India and China. Third, the nascent ballistic missile defense capabilities and anti-satellite capabilities are further weakening the classic nuclear deterrent stability. Fourth, and one that I could spend even more time on, is nuclear terrorism and the role that it plays, particularly in the India-Pakistan context, is very, very problematic. And there has still not been a clear resolution to that challenge. And last is now, not only do you have the traditional border and territorial claim disputes, but you now have new territorial challenges coming up, particularly in the India-China context, in the South China Sea, and in some cases between India and Pakistan in Afghanistan, although that's not territorial, but more in terms of strategic interest. So to conclude, how would we sort of see this going forward? Well, basically, I think South Asia, and here I'm talking about China, India, and Pakistan, have at least two ways forward. One, cooperation, try to build up a kind of a cooperative arrangement, or second, a more confrontational approach, to try and build up the capacity in the more traditional realist approach. And here I have a chart which I will share with you in just a minute to show what are the various kinds of options that are likely to be there. In fact, let me share it with you now. It's kind of a matrix, just to show you that if India, Pakistan, and China were to follow a cooperative approach, what are the various options that they had at the unilateral, bilateral, regional, and even at the global level. And the second is, if they were to follow a more confrontational approach, what are the likely developments we may see at the unilateral, bilateral, regional, and the global level. But the point I want to make here is that this is very structured. It looks very nice and I think clear, but reality is not going to be so clear. In fact, what you're really going to see in Southern Asia is a muddling through approach with a series of ad hoc and informal arrangements which are likely to be more de facto than de jure. Now in this, the United States in particular is going to play an important role. And we've already seen this in the context of the US-India nuclear deal, and we may see similar deals in that region as well. So the central question with which I'd probably like to conclude is say, can these de facto arrangements actually work in the long term? Or do we really need to work towards some kind of a de jure arrangement? And if so, where and how will these de jure arrangements be established? I don't have the answer to that, but I know all of you do. So we will take that up in the discussion. Thank you.